So I'm here with Brenton Lengel, the anarchist playwright, comic book writer, etc. And he just had a debate on modern day debates about the issue of capitalism. I guess the technical title was Capitalism versus Communism, but you were a socialist, so was Krampus, your ally. And it was two libertarians, free market advocates versus yourself. And I thought you kind of stole the show, especially since all the super chats at the end seemed to be directed toward you as insult comedy routines. It really kind of turned into Brent Lengel, the debate. I mean, wouldn't you say?
I think it kind of did. I was feeling bad. I kept trying. I don't know if people noticed. I kept trying to get Krampus to talk, and I guess he didn't want to or whatever. Or, so when I was a kid, like a little kid, and my mom was pregnant with my little brother, she had a nightmare that he came out talking because of me. So yeah, it's actually something that I'm cautious of, that I talk too much. But yeah, that was a. I gotta say that, yeah, I did kind of steal the show there.
You have the gift of gab. What can I say? Now, I thought your opening statement was exquisite. It was just absolutely tremendous, and included so many things that just get overlooked. What was interesting to me is that so much of the debate ended up focusing on the question of worker cooperatives and how they would be implemented. And the part about banking credit, that's where I got kind of lost, because I'm like, that lost me. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
The debate took kind of a turn that I have never seen this debate take before, but it was interesting. I mean, what do you make of that conversation?
I have my suspicions that it's because Vaush has been pushing worker co-ops quite a bit lately, and I heard some points that Krampus said. I don't want to throw Krampus on the bus. I think he was great.
Yeah.
I certain arguments naturally come out through osmosis, and because worker co-ops have been getting pushed a lot lately, I thought that there were a lot of arguments related to worker co-ops, and I can actually see co-ops being a, transitory stage. And I also think it's something that anti-capitalists who aren't necessarily revolutionaries would be very attracted to. So I think that makes a lot of sense for folks. That was my feed on it. I think that's why that got talked about in banking.
Well, what's interesting to me about that conversation is I'm far more open to worker cooperatives than in the past, and part of that has been visiting the anti-imperialist countries and seeing the cooperatives they've set up. And it's interesting because when people talk about cooperatives, they talk about this Valley of Mondragon in Spain, and they tend to talk about Argentina, like the documentary that you plugged about. What was it called? The Take, or
it's called The Take, or it's The Take,
yeah.
Climb, or La Toma. It used to exist on YouTube with English subtitles. Now I think you can see it, but they don't have subtitles. So like, unless you're bilingual, you'll have a hard time understanding it. But it's also on Netflix, I think, or it was for a while.
Okay.
But yeah, it's the recovered factories movement in Argentina, which is one of the things, honestly, that convinced me to become an anarchist.
Well, what's interesting is that, in Russia, which is, no longer a socialist country, no longer run by the Communist Party, the Communist Party runs the Lenin Farm Cooperative, which I've never actually been inside of, but I did meet the CEO of it, Pavel Grudinin, who is the Communist Party presidential candidate in the last election. And he's the CEO of what's called Lenin Farm Cooperative. And it's where it's basically this government subsidized worker cooperative that makes strawberries. And it's kind of, it's like a little community within Russia. The average pay of the worker in Lenin Farm Co-ops is 3 times what the average worker in Russia's pay is.
Oh, wow.
And the school that they go to has teachers from Scandinavia who are much more highly qualified than your typical Russian teacher. And the Communist Party kind of uses Lenin Farm Cooperatives as its kind of like model of what they think, what the Communist Party's vision for all of Russia would be. And that's, during the elections, Pavel Grudinin, who was the CEO of the farm, was technically not even a member of the Communist Party, he's just the CEO of the cooperative. He was their candidate, and that was a big plank of his presidential campaign. I was there to to report on the elections, to cover the elections. And I was in the campaign headquarters, and that was a big part of his presidential campaign. But also I've been to cooperatives in Venezuela, the colectivos that they call them, that the Bolivarian movement has built, where they have these like radio and television stations where the people live there and they share in the profits from any advertising, and they have schools for kids and such. And there's a place called Comuna Pinal that I visited in central Caracas, the Beehive Commune, which is kind of a Christian socialist cooperative. that it is a big part of really existing socialism now. What I also think is interesting is that now Huawei Technologies is public enemy number one in the United States, right? I mean, this Chinese cell phone company, technically under Chinese law, it's a cooperative, and no one talks about this. But Harvard Business Review in 2015 actually ran an article about Huawei Technologies, and it was called "Huawei as an Example of Profit Sharing Working." And it talked about how this company set up by the Chinese government, in cooperation with the military as like this state-run telecommunications firm, technically private, but everyone's paycheck is based on how much profits they make. And that has made the company a lot more efficient than other industries in China. So the cooperative movement has many different angles to it. And I think that's very, very interesting. And that's caused me to rethink it. I used to always just make the point, well, cooperatives are technically operating according to profit, so they could compete with other cooperatives. They put them out of business. That's not really socialism. But, I realized I was kind of missing the point, right? That I think that in a socialist society, worker cooperatives will play a very important role, no doubt.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And I think it's interesting, like, because it's kind of a meme at this point where it's like, oh, cooperatives. But I really think, like, yeah, Mondragon, the Recovered Factories movement. I mean, this is ways you can see an alternative to capitalism that people who are still living within capitalism can understand. Because a lot of times it's very hard to imagine a new world outside of what you have without a point of reference. So
yeah, go on, please.
No, actually, I was just going to tell you to start saying something smart now.
Okay, well, yeah, no, I thought that was interesting as well. Now, what I thought was interesting is that you come out of Anarcho-Communism, right, which is heavily influenced by the revolutionary traditions in Spain and all of that. And it seemed like your fellow socialist came out of more of the liberal turned social democrat kind of camp, the Bernie-ish moving towards social democracy kind of camp. And so it was like you had like the full spectrum, right? Yeah. Would you say that was accurate?
Yeah, I would agree. I should also mention, by the way, because it had me labeled as a socialist. Originally, the reason we did that is he didn't want to label us as two different things to confuse people. And, an anarcho-communist is technically a socialist, but a market socialist is not necessarily a communist. So I said, just call us socialists.
Yeah, well, I mean, that debate that you and I did with the libertarian fellow got confusing because it was like you were the communist, I was the socialist, but I was more tanky than you clearly were. And it got really confusing for a lot of people. And you read the comments, people are like, wait a second, what's going on? And it shows how arbitrary these words really are, right? I mean, Karl Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto. He formed the International Working Men's Association. Bakunin was a member. The anarchists were members. They and Marx had a big fight. So then after the collapse of the International Working Men's Association, the Marxists started using the term social democrats or socialists because they didn't want to be associated with anarchists, right? So social democracy just became the movement. And even the Bolsheviks were originally the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. But then after most of the social democratic parties supported World War I, when the Bolsheviks were on the verge of coming to power, they said, oh boy, we better give ourselves a new name so people don't think we're the party that supported World War I. So they started calling themselves communists again. But then the Soviet Union existed and it was called communists. So then socialists who didn't want to be associated with the Soviet Union started calling themselves social. So it doesn't really, people often ask, what's the difference between a socialist and a communist? And it's like, it's hard to explain because it's like, it means different things in different historical times, I think, and people get very, very confused. The Marxist-Leninist language, uses it to refer to two different historical epochs. Socialism is when the banks, factories, and industries are centrally planned by society, when the workers control the means of production. Communism is the ultimate ideal of a stateless, classless world, right? And but even Marx called what we would call socialism the first stage of communism, and then he referred to the ultimate goal is the higher or the final stage of communism. So, it's all semantical at this point, I think, right? And I mean, I think that a lot of people would refer to the higher stage of communism as anarchy, right? I mean, that's your tradition.
It literally is anarchism. It's funny also, and just to complicate things even more, then you had the anarcho-communist Joseph de Jacques. In France, they outlawed identifying as an anarchist. So he started saying, I'm a libertarian. And he was the first person to ever use the word libertarian in a political sense as opposed to a philosophical sense. And then, of course, you've got Murray Rothbard and the right-wing libertarians stealing the word libertarian from the anarchists so that they could use anarchist language to attack communists.
Well, right. And then it gets even more confusing because the worker cooperative idea, like the workers own and control their individual factory, people associate with anarcho-syndicalism, right?
Yeah, which
But
I
what's
associate with
interesting
socialism.
is that there's anarcho-syndicalism, like the IWW, and but there was this whole other trend of very authoritarian syndicalism that kind of no one ever talks about, right? And that there, like William Z. Foster, who was the prominent leader of the American Communist Party. Before he was the leader of the American Communist Party, he was first in the Wobblies, the IWW, but he didn't agree with their strategy of not joining the existing unions. He wanted to go into the existing unions. So he formed a group called the Syndicalist League of North America, the SLNA. And the SLNA was actually, if you read their manifesto, it was a very authoritarian grouping. It was like, we're going to build this very, very authoritarian state to, it was contradictory. And then there's Sorel, right? George Sorel, who was the very authoritarian syndicalist in France, right? Who was an inspiration not only to Bolshevism and stuff, but also to Mussolini and Franco. They both started, studying his work and then adopted national syndicalism. And then out of that, we had Italian fascism and stuff. So it's very confusing, right? I mean, it's very, very confusing. I mean, when I first heard, the stuff that I think it was Richard Wolff who was pushing the idea of worker cooperatives the hardest, I think, coming out of the financial crisis, I immediately said that's syndicalism. And then people said to me, not really. What would you say the definition of syndicalism is?
I mean, syndicalism seems to me, I always think of like the anarcho-syndicalism of the CNT-FI, where essentially you have society organized around radical labor unions. Whereas co-ops seem like more, society is not organized around the co-ops themselves. They don't run the society, rather business and the economy is organized around co-ops, and then we would still have, I would assume, our normal democratic government in the state and everything else. So I guess it's do you put the union, the radical union, at the center of everything, or are they a part of the overall society is the difference?
Well, what I think is interesting, and this comes across when anti-capitalists are talking to each other, is that it's like the difference, the way it was always explained to me, the three trends of anti-capitalism is social democracy that wants to gradually create socialism out of capitalism one step at a time, communism that wants a revolution for the working class to take control of the state and create socialism, anarchism that says we don't want to use coercion, we want to create it on a voluntary basis, we want to not engage in politics, but instead build up our own institutions. All three of those groups do what the other two do. Communists get elected and carry out parliamentary reforms all the time. Social democrats often end up changing the nature of the state in order to stay in power, right? Both communists and social democrats end up realizing that in order to advance their goals, they have to build a mass movement that builds up cooperatives and worker institutions and non-state entities to back up their goals. So it's like, in a way, all three of the trends kind of mesh together. It's almost a matter of emphasis. How much do you emphasize it? Social democrats emphasize the day-to-day reforms. Communists emphasize the when we come to power stuff. Anarchists emphasize the no cooperation with any state, and independent institutions. But a lot of anarchists vote, right?
Yeah,
a lot of
anarchists
a lot of anarchists talk about an actual revolution, right? So it's all the left trends, they all kind of draw from each other. And that's, as I'm moving to build the Center for Political Innovation, I want us to study all of this and blindly adhere to none of this, because I feel like these lines are not as clear as people would make them out to be. I mean, listen,
I agree with you 150%.
Yeah, there's no like golden line between these trends. These are and different things work in different situations, I think, is the other thing.
Absolutely. Now, you were going to say something about Noam Chomsky, so.
Right. Well, like Noam Chomsky, he says his ideology is anarcho-syndicalism, right? Or libertarian socialism. But the interesting thing is, the more you look at him, he sounds a lot like a social democrat.
Yeah.
In practice, I don't see him building worker cooperatives and boycotting elections. I see him calling for votes for the Democrats. I see him, advocating, smaller reforms that he thinks will eventually lead to a more democratic, egalitarian society. So it's like, on paper, he's a libertarian socialist and an anarchist, but in practice, he's much more social democratic, right? And And I've heard people argue that, like, the Communist Party USA, people say, well, they're technically the Stalinist, Marxist-Leninist party, but if you look at what they do in day-to-day reforms, they're much more social democratic. Whereas, like, some groups that just kind of, scream revolution all day, right, and boycott elect, like the Revolutionary Communist Party, the RCP, they call themselves Maoists and stuff, but in practice, they're a lot like anarchists. It's just that they uphold some stuff that anarchists don't want to be associated with, like Mao and Stalin and stuff like that. So
and Bob Avakian. So they want to sell you a newspaper.
Oh dear, I was gonna. It was funny. The other day, someone super chatted me on a live, and they said, "Are you wearing pants?" And I wanted to reply like, of course I'm wearing Bob Avakian pajamas. What are you kidding? But yeah, I mean, it's the difference is. I thought that your opponents were much more friendly than most libertarian folks. Were they acquaintances of yours beforehand?
So I did not know. The way that debate came out was that Snake asked me to debate him. Mm-hmm. And I was like, okay, yeah, sure. I didn't even know who he was. I was just like, yeah, that sounds like fun. I don't mind talking about it. And then they were having trouble finding finding an opponent to argue on his side because Krampus was already in. I don't know Krampus either. Though
isn't that like a mythical German fairy tale character or something?
It's an evil Santa Claus.
Okay.
And it was really funny because I almost made the gag. We were talking about it at the beginning of the debate. I almost made the gag. I was like, "Oh, evil Santa Claus? You mean Karl Marx?" Not that Karl Marx was evil, but how capitalists have this idea, but the demonic version of Karl Marx. So I think there's some there is some syncretism between him and the figure of the Krampus. Like that could be a meme.
Well, it's funny because Santa Claus is very much rooted in Odin, but Odin is very different than Santa Claus. Santa Claus is a very nice man who goes around helping people. But Odin is this old man with a big white beard who comes once a year at the winter solstice to breathe life back into the earth in wintertime. But he's not a particularly friendly, nice guy. I mean, when you die, you cut yourself open. So he thinks you died in battle and he allows you in heaven because only those who died in battle are allowed. Right? I mean,
well, that's sort of it. I don't know about cutting yourself open. So, okay, you just stumbled onto something that I love.
Go on, please.
I am such a geek for this. I actually wrote a play that is also a screenplay called Berserker, set in Iceland in the year 997, about the real history that undergirds it is King Olaf Tryggvason, who is a Catholic saint, has just been converted to Christianity, and he's waging a bloody war to unite all of the pagan tribes, all of the Norsemen, under his rule. And to that end, he sends Thangbrand, this sort of rambling, bar-fighting preacher who's a Saxon, to Iceland to witness the gospel of Jesus Christ to them. And Thangbrand, by the way, his idea of how to witness the gospel of Jesus Christ is find a Viking, pick a fight with him, murder him, therefore Jesus. Now, that's the history.
Okay.
Yeah, in fact, I think Wordsworth wrote a poem about him, like there goes Thangbrand, Olaf's priest. So I discovered that history, and I started really reading into like all the Norse stuff, and also like the figure of Odin, and the play and is about the creation of a berserker. But it deals very heavily with Odin. Odin's also a character in my novel, After All. He's really big. So what Odin, there were two afterlives for the Norse. There was Valhalla and Folkvangar. Folkvangar is where I think it was Freya or Frigg would take them. That's for the Vikings who weren't warriors who died. And Valhalla is where the ones who were warriors would die, and they would fight all day and feast all night to get ready to fight the frost giants during the events of Ragnarok. So yeah, I could imagine someone stabbing themselves or something, or to make it look like they died in battle, because the Valkyries would come and go, okay, that one's going to the People's Field, that one's going to Odin's mead hall.
Okay. Well, there you go. You know the Norsemen far better than I do.
I'm such a geek. It's fascinating because like Odin is like a trickster figure. He's very different from Zeus, where he occupies the same thing as Zeus. He's an old man. He's a beard. He's the father of everybody. It's literally called All-Father. And the other thing is that there is a story where Odin goes to the Aesir and he's like, we're going to build a wall and we're going to make the frost giants pay for it. Like he's like a trickster figure, and he's a good guy, but he's not really.
He's got kind of a
Yeah.
dark quality to him, doesn't he? I mean,
Yeah.
he's a god of valor. I read Thomas Carlyle's hero worship and the role of the heroic in history, and the first chapter is about Odin. And he argues that it's a very good essay. I mean, Carlyle was kind of a conservative, but he was this Scottish lecturer, and he wrote this book, and he's credited really because it was at a time where in Britain where he was living, to be to be anything but Christian was considered to be just sinful and not respected. And he writes this book. The first chapter is on Odin, the second chapter is on Muhammad. And he argues about heroes and their role in history, and like he talks about Odin as a man god. He argues Odin was probably based on a real person, actually. And then from there, he argues about Muhammad, who's a prophet, and then from there, he talks about kings and then poets, and it's a very good work. I mean, and just looking into the nature of civilizations and what heroes are. And there's a Marxist response to it by Yuri Plekhanov called "The Role of the Individual in History," which is considered the Marxist rebuttal to Thomas Carlyle's work about what is a hero. But I found that to be amusing. In the chapter on Odin, he really just describes Odin as a god of valor. And I found the chapter on Odin to be very poetic and inspiring. But you can tell, I mean, this guy was known not just for his writing, but for his lectures. And like he capitalizes almost every other word in the text to make a point. So this guy must have been crazy. I mean, he's a Scottish preacher. Hey, we are. I mean, I can imagine listening to this guy give a speech. It must have been like a hair-raising experience. Thomas Carlyle, great writer.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, and in fact, we can actually sort of bring that back because, like, you were asking about I think Alex. Now, Alex, now Alex is a former ANCAP. I have spent years arguing with anarcho-capitalists because what happened was that after Occupy, I was looking for a way to continue to do activism beyond just my radio show. And what happened was that I didn't even know anarcho-capitalists existed. And then what happened was a bunch of them mass reported the Facebook page Anarchist Memes, which was one of the bigger anarchist pages out there, and they got it temporarily taken down, and then they made their own ANCAP anarchist memes with the same name and the same to try to trick everybody into joining their page so they could be the real anarchists and subsume the place. And that got me into I did some interviews with people from the Anarchist Memes page on my radio show, and then people were like, oh, this guy really knows a lot about anarchism. So they made me an admin of an ANCAP versus ANCOM debate group on Facebook, and we actually wound up having like a really good group for a while. It's not called that anymore. Now it's called Libertarian versus Anarchism Debate, because the ANCAPs then again went in and tried to make their own version of the group and trick everybody, because some of them are just idiots and assholes. But Alex was one of the smarter ANCAPs, and I recognized that from the very beginning, and I went after him hard. Well, initially, like I was a real jerk for a while in the comments and stuff. And then gradually I opened up to him and we started talking and became friends. And, I disagree with him, but he's very, very sharp, and I'm very happy. Like I felt like he was a really good presence in the debate.
Yeah, well, I hope he doesn't get in trouble at his job. I mean,
I hope not too. I don't think he will.
Honestly. I don't know what bank he's at or anything. I saw him give that disclaimer, and I was like, oh boy, you know what I mean? Like that could be used against him, but whatever, I would have avoided that. Being friends with someone who disagrees with you, Brenton. Imagine. I mean, does this ever happen? I mean.
Yeah, I mean, well, you got to think like our friendship too, and this is so. There's a play. There's a play called The Chosen by Chaim Potok, I think is how you say his name, and I saw it at Actors Theater of Louisville before I moved to New York, and there is a line in that play where one of the father characters says that friendship should never be based on just on similarities of opinion. And so I've worked very hard to surround myself with people that I can trust and rely on that may not think the same as me. In fact, I think it's great. Like my writing partner and I, we're almost opposites. You and I have very different views on socialism. Me and Alex and a number of the ANCAPs that I met in that anarcho-capitalist group. Like, I mean, there's some horrible ANCAPs. There's like who are basically fascists like Christopher Cantwell, but a number of the other admins and other members of those groups are some of my best online friends, and have been really influential on me, and I hope I've been influential on them.
Well, I mean, I thought you're supposed to cancel everyone who you have any slight disagreement with.
Cancel them and destroy.
Right? Yeah. No, I mean, when we were talking about this earlier this week, I immediately started thinking of the musical Oklahoma and the song "The Farmer and the Cowman Can Be Friends." I don't know why, but it's just, it's like the anarchist and the communist can be friends, but.
It's interesting there too, because what was it Otto von Bismarck said after the breakup of the First International? The crowned heads of Europe will quake with terror if ever the black and red again reunite. I think honestly there's a lot of stuff that I think leftists have this terrible tendency to engage in these very vicious purity spirals. And it's because a lot of us are unable to achieve our very high political goals. So because we're unable to do that, we need to feel like we're doing something. So we try to tear people down. And it's easier to tear down people who are like us than to attack those that do not share our values. So people would rather call a fellow socialist a fascist than actually attack a fascist.
Well, it's amusing. There's a guy, and I don't remember his name, and I won't say the name of his group. I put that in quotes, but I used to go to rallies a lot in New York City, and this week I got to go to a Palestine rally because it was 3 blocks from my house, and I went there and interviewed people. It was like the first political rally I'd been to in years, right? I just don't do that anymore now that I'm a reporter, and I don't do that kind of thing. But I went to it just to, film it and interview people. And it reminded me of when, years ago I used to go to rallies. There used to be this guy, and his name, I can't remember his name, but he was his own party. He was a Trotskyist, and he had at one point been in the Spartacist League, and then he had been in one of the splits from the Spartacist League, and now he was a one-man party. And he had this newspaper that he printed himself. Poor guy. He printed himself. It had the big 4 for Fourth International and the big hammer and sickle on it. And I would always buy his newspaper from him, and it wasn't really a newspaper. It was more like a stapled printout sheets.
It was a zine.
It was a zine, basically. And I would always buy it from him out of respect. But I noticed that every article in his zine, every time I bought it, was an attack on another socialist group. And I said to him one time, I said, you're the only guy in your group. Like, have you ever thought about, maybe in your magazine, publishing articles like what is socialism, why capitalism is bad? And maybe you can meet somebody who's never heard of these ideas before, and you can make them into your kind of socialist, and then there'll be more than one person in your group. And he looked at me with a straight face, like I had just offended him. And I remember he said to me, Caleb, the road to the masses is through the Vanguard Party. And if the Vanguard Party does not have the correct political line, going to the masses is wasteful.
Oh,
and I thought, okay, then. All right. Well, good luck to you. And I was just kind of floored at that moment. And it was just and he said at one point, he said that the Trotskyists were calling themselves the vanguard of the vanguard. The Communist Party was the vanguard. They were the vanguard of the vanguard. And he said, I'll think of myself as the vanguard of the vanguard of the vanguard of the vanguard. And I said, well, good for you. Good for you. Great. That's beautiful. But it's kind of sad, you know what I mean? And that a lot of leftism is kind of like that. Wouldn't you agree?
I would. Here's the thing. Radicals, radicals are nuts. You don't become a radical if everything in your life is going great all the time. There is something within us that we cannot reconcile with the rest of the world. And a lot of my art comes out of that, but also a lot of my political ideas and a lot of, you don't look for an answer if you don't have problems. An answer outside of the norm. And so I think a lot of the time, people are playing with identity. People are folks who don't fit in, who may occasionally have social problems with other people. And so they kind of look to radical politics as a way to find and build a community and to kind of integrate themselves or to find new people. Because it's horrible and isolating when you don't have people, when you don't have a tribe to be a part of. And it took me until I hiked the Appalachian Trail, I met the thru hikers, I'd never felt accepted anywhere. And similarly, like New York was another big thing because I was so scared going into New York and being like, what's going to happen? I've got to make friends again. It's this giant city. And luckily I found a wonderful community of artists and I found Occupy Wall Street. But, a lot of people haven't had a chance to find that, I think. And it's something that goes untalked about with regard to street activism as opposed to online activism. Because I think we talked a little bit about this after the debate with Vaush, and it was like when I talked with him later, I was kind of like trying to make the point that you don't necessarily have to agree with everybody as long as the people around you can be counted on in a pinch. That you have general things in common and this person is not going to flake or that this person is going to show up. And I realized talking to you afterwards, I was like, oh, that's something I learned in the street. Um, and I feel like in the same way, there's a lot of people that haven't learned that maybe because they've spent too much time online.
Indeed. And the online world can be a very, very negative place. And people have talked about this, the Twitter mindset, where Twitter kind of encourages you to fight with other people. And the other thing is that there's a concept that comes out of Sigmund Freud called the narcissism of small differences.
I think I've heard this.
Yeah, where people are more threatened by people who are close to them than they are threatened by people who are distant from them. Right? And that the more someone reminds you of yourself, the more hostile you will be to them. And that like countries that are very similar in culture, very similar in history, tend to go to war more often. Whereas countries that are vastly different tend to just kind of respect each other. And that this is a really common trend, the narcissism of small differences, which I think is quite interesting. And that's an aspect of all of this. But yeah, I mean, I think you're right about everything. That there's just a tendency on the left. But when you said the thing about people being broken, not people being broken, but people, if they're not looking for things to change, if they don't have problems.
Yeah.
I immediately thought of the Workers' World Party, which I was a member of for years. I mean, I was with them. I mean, Sam Marcy, the founder, had already died by the time I was with them. There had been this split. Most of the party had broken away and formed the Party of Socialism and Liberation in 2004. I joined them in 2007. But especially when I was living in New York, their members, a lot of them, your typical member of the Workers' World Party was a baby boomer who was LGBT and was from a family that had been, their parents had been sympathizers with the Communist Party USA in the 1930s. And, you talk to those folks and Leslie Feinberg, who was the first transgender activist in all of U.S. history. I did have the honor of interacting with her on a few occasions. I'm not going to say I was close to her, but when I was first coming around, she was around and we would talk on the phone every so often about newspaper articles and stuff. But, there's a reason. And that if you look at it, what it really was, that was for a lot of these people, who were LGBT in a time where there was no acceptance of that whatsoever, in an era before Stonewall, for a lot of them, this was kind of their new family, right? They didn't fit in with their family. They didn't fit in with their parents, but they kind of had grown up hearing that communism was not all bad. And so they found this kind of activist family, you know what I mean, that they could be part of. And it was a place they could fit in. And it had an office where they could go every day after school or after work. They could learn. They would help people learn to be typesetters or proofreaders for magazines. And it was kind of this little community you could be part of if you didn't fit in with capitalism. And that's who the Workers' World Party really was in its heyday, in its strength in like the 60s, 70s, and 80s. It started to decline in the 90s, and it's splintered and split into a million pieces at this point. But that's really who they were. And that struck me that's what came to my mind, I guess, as you were talking about that. Because for these people, that's what it was. I mean, and it was a lot of LGBT folks, and the group was known as being pro-LGBT before most communist groups were, and that's why, it became kind of a home for them, which is interesting because you would think, because there's hardline, ML tanky group that supports North Korea, you'd think they'd be very homophobic, but they were pro-LGBT before anybody. But it's kind of speaks to what the group was, right? I mean, it was a place for people that were kind of lost.
No, I it almost sounds a little like Soka Gakkai. In the sense of, now SGI is a much bigger organization. We're in 192 countries. But, one of the great things about Soka Gakkai is, we build community centers. And so in New York, I think I took you by and showed you the STI Community Center, and you saw the pictures of like Daisaku Keita with Nelson Mandela and Rosa Parks and all that, which I was excited about.
Yeah.
I didn't even know that. Like, that wasn't part of like the pitch when I joined. I was just like there and looking at the pictures. I'm like, is that Nelson Mandela? Part of it was having part of a religious organization is having a space to go to where you feel safe, and community to interact with. My open mic was a bit like that as well. Just places where people can go and congregate and spend their time with other people in fellowship. I think it's something that's lacking from our highly secularized society. And it sounds like there was a little bit of that, and that may have contributed to some of the success of the Workers' World Party at its heyday.
Well, that was interesting because I remember at one point I was living in a basement with three other, with 3 or 4 other youth that were around the Workers' World Party. Mm-hmm. And I thought it was interesting because, I remember, one of them was from the South, was from like the Florida Panhandle. And I remember we would go to their Friday night meetings. And I remember he said to me one time, he said, this feels like communist church. I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, we get together, we sing a few songs, we eat some donuts, there's a bunch of old people here, we listen to some speeches, we shake hands, we go home. This sounds a lot like church, except it's on Friday night, not Sunday morning. And I couldn't disagree with him. I mean, that was kind of what it was. Every Friday, it was like, communist church and, and go and, I mean, he was right about that. But the other thing was that I noticed that a lot of the youth that came around the Workers' World Party were from a completely different background, right? This guy was from the Florida Panhandle. My other roommate was from Alabama. My other roommate was from South Florida and had worked at Disney for a long time. And it seemed like the younger people that came around the Workers' World Party were never like from that activist-y milieu. They were young people that had kind of discovered this stuff on their own, were looking for some kind of hardline tanky group and found them and didn't quite fit in with them because this hardline tanky group was part of this wider left milieu that they never really felt at home with and had never really had a connection to. And there was this weird disconnect. But another friend of mine said to me, there is this weird trend, and I don't see it so much of it anymore, of like young guys that would be Nazis that like have like army boots. You know what I'm talking about? They have army boots and a collection of like Soviet memorabilia and all of that. And I've noticed, you know what I'm talking about? And it's like they're into weapons and stuff. I don't see that as much anymore. I used to see a lot of that. That used to be really common. I'd encounter like guys that are North Korea enthusiasts and have army boots and, and can tell you the history of the Soviet, firearms, But I don't meet those guys anymore. I wonder what happened to those guys. I hope they haven't all become Nazis. But
I really hope they haven't all become Nazis. I mean, I think there's a number of, IRL tanks that are people that are mainly Soviet army fetishists. They really like, and, the USSR has a really cool aesthetic, and it's a great way to stand out, even in the United States. Like, I think I bought a number of communist-y looking stuff from the Army Navy surplus store in near McDougal Street. It was a great shop. And in fact, I think that friend of yours also, he had a similar jacket to mine, the one that was manned by the People's. It had the patch with the rifle and the red flag on it.
Maybe. Yeah. I think a friend of mine. Yeah.
I mean, a buddy of mine, the guy who kind of got me into radical politics, who eventually became a tank, and we reenacted the Black-Red Divide because he was my roommate at the time, and he was having a bunch of problems. It wasn't just that. But like, he was the guy who got me into radical politics. And I know before that, he was like a big-time goth. And he also got me into goth music and stuff. So, I think there's a political element to it, and there's also a subcultural element to it. And, there's a bunch of weird people out there.
The main thing is, though, I mean, and I said this on my live earlier tonight, is that if things are really going to change in the United States, it needs to not be that people on their own get interested in communism and then go and track down desperately a communist party to join. It needs to be that communist groups, socialist groups, anarchist groups are in neighborhoods and in communities, and people like what they're doing and find out that they are socialist, communist, anarchists and say, oh, wow, I'm going to check that out because that's what you all are. That's when things really changed. When the Communist Party of the United States was strong, it wasn't because people read about communism and then ran and found them. It was because of what they were doing. And people are like, oh, you're communists and you're doing this. That's great.
Yeah.
And the same with
materialism versus idealism, almost.
Yeah, and that I so many people that get into communism. That was my experience. Nobody in my family was a communist. There weren't communists in my little tiny town in Ohio. I mean, so I remember there was a website called the Red Encyclopedia. It's not around anymore. It's on the Wayback Machine, but it's been taken down. But it had a list of communist groups. And I remember when I first found out there was actually a communist party in the United States, I was blown away because I assumed that nobody in the United States would believe in communism. I was like, there's a communist party? And then I found out there's like 50 communist parties. I'm like, this is fascinating. And so I remember spending like weeks learning the difference between all these little groups. And when I would first start going to anti-war rallies, it was almost like a scavenger hunt. If I could find somebody from one of the different groups, like, wow, I found somebody from the Maoist internationalist movement. And wow, I found someone from the Revolutionary Workers League. That's a rare one. No one knows where that one is. It was almost like this little subculture I knew nothing about, and it was like fascinating to me. And I don't feel that way anymore. I mean, now, at this point, I mean, I'm a socialist. I advocate 21st century socialism with American characteristics. I'm definitely an anti-imperialist, but I'm kind of over the whole left scene. I'm a little bit disappointed in it, and I feel like we need to get to the broad masses of American people. There are millions of people who are suffering right now who would be open to a socialist message, but we have to get out of the I don't know, the cringe, the crazy. We have to find a way to get to them and get them to understand that this isn't an attack on them. This isn't a plot to destroy them and their way of life. This is a plot to save their lives from the crisis capitalism is leading us to. Capitalism is driving us over a cliff, and we have to take control of the wheel and turn the car around. And if we don't do that, it's going to be only worse. This pandemic is just the beginning. So that's kind of where I'm at. But what do you think?
I mean, I agree with you on that. There's a reason why I describe myself as an anarchist and a communist, but I don't identify as part of the left. And it's not because I don't agree with the broadly, like with the leftists, and culturally I understand leftists. I'll use phrases like solidarity. You always see me doing the up twinkle in the debates and stuff. But like, I want to make it clear, like, to people when they ask me that, or like, are you right or left? I think for myself. Because, one of the things that I noticed at Occupy was sometimes, and this was a problem, was we would get stuck into that group think, and there'd be something that, maybe wouldn't be entirely correct, but everyone would suddenly go to try to, adopt it because that's the popular line against this media machine that wanted to slander all of us. And I kind of realized coming through that, oh, hang on, just, keep yourself grounded and don't get swept up in, I guess, a lot of the politics of politics, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Well, Brenton, I just want to let you know you did amazingly well in the debate tonight. No one could have done it better. You represented socialism very effectively, drawing from the Marxist tradition, the anarchist tradition, dissecting libertarian arguments you're very familiar with. You kicked ass, my friend.
Well, I couldn't have done it without you, because you'll notice I talked about prophets being in command. And
well, you couldn't have done it without Mao. That's Mao Zedong. So there you go. But there you go.
Wow, I quoted Mao by accident. You tricked me into quoting Mao.
I did. I guess so. Well, it's really been a pleasure. I really enjoyed watching. I know you've got another debate with the Sargon of Akkad coming up, right? That's going to be
Yes,
big.
I do. That should be very soon, though he hasn't confirmed yet. But they're promoting it. It's going to be about trans women competing in sports. And dude, this is fascinating. Like, I thought I would have a strong case before, but with the research I'm doing, like, holy crap. So I'm excited about that.
Well, MDD has said I pitched them on it, and they are very interested on a debate with one of their religious guests on was Jesus a socialist?
Yes. Oh, dude, that's going to be incredible.
I'm very excited. I'm already doing the research. I don't even know who my opponent is, and I'm looking forward. If that one will happen, I'll do it. I'm a little burned on debates right now, but that's a debate I want to do, and that will not be like any other debate, right? I mean, that'll be a one-of-a-kind show. So I'm looking for a competitor on Was Jesus a Socialist? And
that's going to be great. I congratulate you. I will definitely watch it. Also, I don't know if you heard, and this was news to me, but apparently they're looking into possibly having me debating Jesse Lee Peterson.
Hey, I would love to debate that guy.
He's an interesting guy.
He has this tactic where he says, Brenton, where are you from? And you say, Kentucky. He says, I rest my case. Like, I mean, he does that a lot where it's like,
Yeah.
he'll ask you a random question, you'll answer it, and he'll say, see? and it's like, no, I don't see. But, you know,
what are you talking about?
I don't know. Like watch his debate with Destiny, right? It's very amusing where he says to Destiny, like, you know, he's like, were you close to your mother or your father? And he says, both. And he says, so you're half man, half woman. He said, no. Like, I mean, it's he has this kind of Socratic method where he asks you questions and then determines things from the questions that make no sense.
Yeah, there's somebody actually went and did that as an episode of South Park. You can watch. It's hilarious. So it's like you're watching South Park, but it's Jesse Lee Peterson interviewing Destiny.
Wow.
So
there you go.
Yeah, that'll be an interesting and excruciating topic, but you know, who knows? He's got a lot of people who like to watch him, so it might be fun.
What would the topic he debates with you be?
I have no idea. Like, I don't watch enough of Jesse Lee Peterson to see where we disagree. I assume on just about everything, so it could be anything. It'll probably depend on what modern day debate wants to talk about.
Well, good luck with it. Good luck with it. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, Brenton. Folks should remember to check out Snow White Zombie Apocalypse.
Yeah, and if you can subscribe to my channel, I'm getting closer and closer to breaking 1,000 subscribers.
Excellent. So. Excellent. Well, it's really good to be able to be a YouTube partner. So best wishes on that, and I'll say good night.
Good night.
Yep.